Welcome to Momentous. I am Pastor Rebecca Great, the pastor and mission developer for Momentous and the host for our weekly podcast. At Momentous, we believe that God is present with us in each and every single one of our moments. We believe that our stories are connected to God's story and to one another's stories. We believe that this connection and relationship changes our lives and our entire world. Now, before we begin, I invite you to take a deep breath in. Hold it while you count to 3, and then slowly release that breath. Today, we are joined by Ethan Roberts, who serves as the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving at Capital University. Ethan, why don't you more fully introduce yourself to the Momentous community?
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Pastor Rebecca, and to all of you in the Momentous community. As you just said, my name's Ethan, and I work at Capital University. I'm actually an alumnus in the class of 2022 from there. I just recently turned 24 years old last week, and I've been an ELCA Lutheran most of my whole life, and have taken advantage of many of the ministries of the church, and those have forever impacted and enriched my life. Most recently, I was a young adult in global mission in Manchester in the United Kingdom, and just got back 3 months ago.
Say a little bit more about what being a young adult in global mission is. Like, is that a year-long program? And what did you do while you were in Manchester?
Absolutely. So Young Adults in Global Mission, or YAGM for short, is a year of service program through the ELCA. It operates in various countries across the world. Currently, for this year, it was operating in 5, but they've just recalled the missionaries who were serving in Jerusalem and the West Bank. So do be praying for them, as their whole next year of life has been radically changed from what they imagined it would be. But yeah, volunteers spend about 10 to 12 months ish serving and living in community. I was in, like I said, Manchester. I was primarily placed at Sacred Trinity Church, which is an Anglican church in the city center of Manchester, the Salford portion of it. I work there 3 days a week, helping them with their programming, services, and all aspects of ministry. I also worked 1 day a week at a primary school with their year 5 students, which is our equivalent of fourth graders. And I also spent a day working in a L'Arche community home. L'Arche is a French Catholic organization. L'Arche is French for the Ark, and it's community homes for people with learning disabilities. And I lived with a wonderful, wonderful host family and community. And the years kind of, well, I guess, the director should say there's lots of goals, but I see most of them being based around, first off, seeing that God is already everywhere else in the world, right? We aren't taking God anywhere that God isn't already. The next part is learning to just accompany people, walk alongside them, live into that ministry of Jesus coming down to be alongside us. And third, just see how culture works differently. Even in a place like England where they speak English, it's quite different.
I can imagine that that year was incredibly transformational. And my hunch is, because you just came back a few months ago, my hunch is you're probably still like beginning to unpack everything that that year has taught you.
Absolutely. Yeah. People kind of keep asking me, like, sum up the year and stuff, which is difficult to do, but I really keep coming back to that word enrichment. It's just one of those aspects of life that can't be put into words, how it, impacts your faith, impacts how you look at relationships, impacts the way you imagine your life going. And yes, there's big things and small things that have since come back and being here. I knew I was definitely getting too comfortable in England when I was at Stonehenge, which of course is a big tourist spot, and there was a big group of Americans being somewhat loud. And in my mind, I went, "Oh, Americans!" And I thought, "Wait a second." And so coming back, I definitely had to sort that out in my mind a bit and in my personality. But yeah, I'll feel comfortable, and then something will just grab me, and it's like I'm back there.
So this fall, Momentous is embarking on this big theme called Burning Questions. And these questions all come from members of the Momentous community who were already connected via our social media accounts. And the question we posed to the community was, what confuses you about God or Christianity or the church or the Bible? And we kept that up for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and we got a lot of responses because surprisingly, we have some questions about those things. So this week, we're focusing in on the question someone submitted that is, I'm in my 20s. Why isn't there anyone else my age at church? I know you, Ethan, from several different things where you are involved in the church in some way while you are in your 20s. So, can you share anything about why you felt called to be involved in the church? I knew you to be involved in the church through college, but maybe you were involved in the church prior to college. So, can you share a little bit more about why you feel called to be involved in the church?
Absolutely. I think, like a lot of people who grew up in church, and I also grew up going to a non-denominational Christian school. Uh, you kind of almost have these like two quote unquote call stories, right? One where you just grow up with faith, and the other one it's okay, this is something real. And for me, that most certainly happened at the 2015 youth gathering in Detroit, because I too, even at 15, you're a teenager, but you're inching towards young adulthood, was going through this question in my mind, right? All of my friends at school went to what I call the mini mega churches around town, where they seem to just have all kinds of friends and people my age. And we went to a Lutheran church, and I loved it. But there were like two friends my age there, right? And that was a bit disheartening. And so going to the youth gathering was the first time where, and if you haven't been to a youth gathering or you aren't Lutheran, it's every 3 years. The ELCA does a basically a convention for young adults that brings them, well, teenagers, young adults rather, brings us in from all over the country. And there's roughly 30,000 people, depending on the year. And there's service, and there's worship, and there's games, and anything you can imagine. And so the first time I went into Forbes Field in Detroit for worship, and there's 30,000 people, roughly my age, it kind of smacks you that out. You aren't alone. There are people your age going to church, part of the church, thinking about this, right? I think why I was there was when it kind of sat in that this is serious stuff, right? And not serious in a bad way. We kind of conflate serious with meaning something, can't get wrong, or it might be turn out bad, but serious and this is something good, something you need to take advantage of. And I think it's just kind of, been one step after another for me with church and faith life and staying involved. I was, as I think about this question, I think kind of three things come to mind for me in terms of why do I feel called to be part of church? And first is it's in a place to express faith, right? I see God every day. When I'm not in church, God is everywhere. But church is a singular public community where I feel that I become part of something bigger than myself. And it's kind of energizing in a way that I don't get when I'm just in my everyday walk. And it's a chance to encounter something sacred in a very different way than what you might just find in your routine of everyday living. Another reason I've stayed involved in church is because I firmly believe church is where your life happens. I don't see how people get by without kind of this built-in social safety net that comes from being part of a faith community. And I think that applies to all people of faith, whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist. I think there's something about knowing if I didn't have my family, the people I'd probably call are people who I went to church with or who I have met through a ministry of the ELCA, right? And I consider those ministries just to be as much a part of church as sitting in a building Sunday morning. And I think the last thing that really keeps me involved in church and makes me want to go is that the church, and I mean kind of church at large, the capital C, is arguably the biggest change agent and positive force for good that's ever existed. That's not to say church hasn't messed up profoundly multiple times, but taking a wide angle lens, I think you can really see how the church makes things happen nationally, locally, and globally. And being a part of that, even if it seems small, just being on a Sunday morning draws me in.
In next week's podcast, we are sharing a conversation that we had with Deacon Nick Bates, who is the executive director of the Hunger Network in Ohio. And it's a fascinating conversation where he shares about what his position is and how his call as a deacon within our denomination is to advocate at the state level in the government for everyone to have access to the food they need. And so like that burning question for next week is, can Christians be involved in politics? But what you just said about how the church can be an agent for change and positive change, especially when that means like looking at the church's history and how we have not done that well, so that we can make the repairs and strive for the reconciliation so that we can learn from our mistakes and move forward so that we continue to be an agent for positive change in the world. I think that is huge. And that is sometimes a message that gets lost in like national news media because it's not always the picture of the church that is shared. So I love that that's the experience of church that you have. And that is like one of your core top 3 biggest reasons why you feel called to be involved in the church in whatever that looks like. That's huge.
I appreciate that absolutely, and I totally understand where people come from. With the church has hurt a lot of people, and not just people at large. You know, we're talking people personally, right? And that is a totally valid experience. And as someone who walks into a sanctuary with all the privilege the world gives, I'm well aware that I don't have that same thing to come with it. And so what your experience with church, that's probably not going to be one of your top 3, or you might have to look at it in a different way.
I think anytime the church is successful in creating a sense of community, knowing that someone feels safe there, I think that's positive. So can I ask you a question that may feel a little pointed?
Absolutely.
Are you still involved in the church now? Like you talked about some things in the past and like youth gatherings and how formational that was. So are you still involved in the church now?
Yes, so I am still involved in the church, but it's kind of a lot to think in terms of the ways I'm involved, right? So, as I said earlier, I graduated from Capital a few years ago, and up until that point in my senior year, I was very much going to church with a friend on Sunday mornings in Columbus Lutheran Church there. but also being a part of an Abide group. Abide is a ministry of the ELCA that is nationwide small groups, essentially, for young adults to come together and discuss their faith and their life. And I'm going to give a shout out to my small group. That's Catherine, Macy, Maggie, Sarah, and Emily. They've just become a huge part of my life over the past, well, we started meeting in, that would have been spring of 2020. So we're well over 3 years now, and we're probably one of the longer lasting groups. We've met almost weekly, most weeks for that entire time. And so they're a big part of my faith community, and just having a chance each week, even if instead of talking about a question or a part of the Bible, we just talk about what's been happening in life, it all kind of ties back together in a sacred way. I spent the summer in between going to Yagam and graduating out at Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp, which is a ministry of the Rocky Mountain Synod of the ELCA. That was my second summer out there. And of course, when you're working at Lutheran camp for the summer, you are way too busy to go to church on Sundays, or at least traditional worship on a Sunday. But you are doing a lot of worshiping and thinking about your faith and talking with young adults and kids. So a very intense time of being active in my faith there. And then, of course, like I said, with Yagam, working at the church I was at, opened up so many incredible opportunities for conversation. I was working on a Sunday, right, at church. I had to be there. But past that, there were opportunities for a conversation that wasn't, quote unquote, part of the job, that I feel were just as much as going to church as, having chosen to be there on a Sunday morning. So it's odd at this moment to feel like I'm kind of navigating not being in a super intense setting for the first time in the year, right? Going essentially right from camp, right to Yagam. I almost had these two very deeply intense faith and church experiences. And now that I'm back in Central Ohio, I still have my Abide group. They've been a huge wellspring for me. I did get out to Colorado for a week in August to kind of reconnect there. But I'm also, trying to figure out what does more of getting back into that Sunday groove look like in the traditional sense of church.
Yeah, Sunday mornings are really hard. I, from the time I was born almost, have always been someone who is much more energized at night, to the tune that my mom would regularly look at me and say, "Honey, you need a night shift job." And then God called me to be a pastor, and that usually means Sunday mornings, early in the morning, you are out and making sure that everything is ready for worship, and then you worship. And then you go home for a very long nap to rest and recover. But the Sunday morning thing, it can be really hard.
That's, the church I worked at in England had a different Sunday evening service every Sunday of the week. So we would do the first Sunday worship in the style of the Taizé community, which is a Catholic organization in France that does some really cool focuses on silence and kind of repetitive chants. We would do one Sunday that was a topic. We just pick a topic and talk. The third Sunday was Open Table, which is a LGBTQ friendly, welcoming, specific service. And then the fourth Sunday, talk about a part of the Bible. And if there was a fifth Sunday, we just went to the pub, which is a very British thing to do. But those kind of less structured, I would say gentler spaces are a huge part of church. And if Sunday morning is hard for you to plug in, find those places.
So those kinds of places, I'm going to take 3 or 5 seconds to encourage everyone to listen through to the end of this podcast, because we have some announcements about some of our in-person and digital gatherings. for Momentous that we're hoping have that kind of open sense around it. Yes, one of them is on a Sunday morning, but there are also others that are not on Sunday mornings. So make sure you listen all the way through this episode so you can hear more about when and where those are so you can add them to your schedules. Ethan, I know you are someone who has been involved in the church, but my hunch is like I remember you saying that you were like one of a handful or less than a handful at your congregation growing up. And you had all these other friends that were members of other churches. And if the congregation you grew up in is like congregations I grew up in or congregations I served, we may have had other friends at church until about the time of confirmation. And then everybody got confirmed and then they said, poof, and they're gone. But I still stayed like friends with people I was confirmed with that I didn't see at church anymore. But I also know that I'm not in my 20s anymore. So I'm curious if you have heard from others about like why they aren't either involved or as involved in the church anymore. Like, is it as easy as it Sunday mornings being hard, or is it the programming, or is it how a lot of congregations tend to focus on activities and ministries for older adults or young adults who have kids and not young adults who are single or don't have kids? Or is it all of those things, or is it other things that you've heard?
Absolutely. I think it's a combination of a lot of what you just said, right? I mean, I think first off, young adults not being at church as much, people in their 20s, it's part of a larger societal change, right? Not only are there less young adults attending, there's, yes, less people who are our parents' age, and, more and more less people who are our grandparents' age attending. It's across the board in many ways. And I think we forget sometimes that the social pressures that we're having, full congregations when our grandparents would have just been confirmed, no longer exist in the same way that we do. And in many ways, that's an okay thing, right? It's not just about people in pews, but that has affected the ways in which we do worship, right? Even people our parents' age couldn't have imagined the idea that there would be soccer games on a Sunday morning, right? And now church has to compete a lot against a lot of different things in ways it never had to. I think we touched on earlier, basically how the church has treated people, especially as younger people are looking for a more diverse, welcoming, appreciative congregation. Um, I think a lot about. I grew up on The Simpsons in my household, and there's one of my favorite episodes is when uh, Reverend Lovejoy, who's the pastor of the church, loses a lot of members, right? And he has this vision when he's standing in the sanctuary, and he's looking at the stained glass windows of saints, and he looks at one and he says, "What have I done to lose them?" And one of the saints comes to life and says, "Well, what have you done to keep them?" And I think that oftentimes the church too quickly says, "Well, what's wrong with them?" without saying, "What have we not done to keep people involved? What have we not been able to look in the mirror and say, we aren't meeting young people where they're at clearly, not just in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense and a sense of their beliefs?" And I would tell you, I have a good number of friends who would say they aren't Christian, or they say they aren't people of faith, or they don't believe in God. And it doesn't take much conversation to then, in the back of my mind, be going, "Well, I think you do. The things you are saying lead me to believe that you do believe in something," right? Um, I think a lot of young people have faith lives, but they're struggling to find a place for it. And my personal belief is church. And to the person who asked this question, or anyone else who's asking this question, you are part of the church and you can help meet those people where they're at. Um, but it is difficult for those people who are struggling with that to come to an institution that they know has not always taken them seriously. And once again, that's totally valid. So yeah, I would say all those factors merging as one, I think, is where we're at the moment.
Yeah, and so many factors kind of intertwining with one another means that a solution for helping people grow in their faith and bringing them in as part of the community, like there's not a single answer that's going to fix it if it needs to be fixed. Because there's argument about, do we need to figure out a way to make the previous model that we've known the church to be work, or do we need to look for new models of church? Given that I'm now a pastor mission developer for something experimental, I think we know where I land on the opinions on that question. But it is so tricky to find a faithful way forward that will help an entire community grow in its faith, especially when there's that overlap of preference for what they have known since like they grew up in the church and they remember being at the church in the 60s and 70s whenever they were younger, and folks now who are young adults who came into being young adults and graduating high school in the height of the pandemic, which changes so many things about our world and how we interact with one another and how we find meaning. And does meeting, like I'll pick on abide in a good way,
Mhm.
But my hunch is, because like for you, abide has been such a gift. And my hunch is you meet with your abide group via technology in some way, shape, or form, right?
Yes,
Great.
I have met all of them except one who lives in Canada in person at some point, but never all together. So, yes.
And so for your group, you found connection and meeting using technology. But I wonder if there are other people um, in their late teens, early 20s, maybe into early 30s, who the thought of having to do a Zoom meeting or some type of technology meeting to find connection is just too hard because it reminds them of how hard things were during the height of the pandemic. And like, I love that the ELCA Young Adult Ministry thought of Abide being a thing because, oh my gosh, I think it's an amazing program. Keep doing it, please. Right. But how do we also accompany and create community for those who just can't do the technology thing? And that's just one little pocket of the population. It's a hard thing to figure out what the most faithful way forward is. And it's also hard when when the church tries to dream up new things to try to attract all of our young adults back, and they haven't talked to a single young adult about what their needs are. And so, um, then there's all of this energy and time investment put in, um, and it doesn't go well because we haven't talked to our young adult friends about, hi, how are things in your life? What is something that the church can do that would help? How can we actually accompany you and continue to be a community for you, even if that means that we don't see you on Sunday mornings? We still love you and care about you. And that can be a level of risk that not every congregation's ready to take.
100%. Um, some words that a friend of mine shared in the past day, my friend Emily from my Abide group, we were talking about this kind of work from home societal change. And she said something I thought was really just full of wisdom, and that was that a rigid commitment of Sunday mornings being the only valid expression of, quote, church is inflexible with society's demands today, especially young adults, where we are in this world that seems to be asking more and more, which I think is especially difficult for many of us after COVID, right? Where it seemed to be that actually we saw the world can be all right if the pace is slower and everyone's a little bit gentler with one another. And we've 180'd, right? We've just gone right back to how it is. And that is quite a bit to process. And you're right within the way that churches don't ask young adults. I think we tend to think of these big gaps of history, right? Our parent, or rather our grandparents, are the people who were being confirmed when everyone was still going to church, the societal pressures, right? It's not that far off. So sometimes it is difficult to say to them and have a conversation of, well, why are my friends aren't coming to church, without being told, well, they just don't get it. What we need to do is buckle down on what we've always done. And because to them, that's when the grass was greener and the baskets were fuller. And I try to have grace for that, while also saying, no, clearly there were different things at play there than there are at the world today.
What is something you wish that people would or wouldn't assume about you simply because you're in your 20s?
I think personally, for many people who continue to show up for worship in their early 20s, mid 20s, what have you, it can easily be assumed a number of things. And the first of all, you're going to fix everything, right? All we need is, you to help with this, you to help with that, you to do this, you to do that. And it's not, excuse me, my job or any other person who's in their 20s and going church a lot, their job fix everything. Because at the end of the day, as much as I think it's great for people to be involved, and I know some churches use over involvement to kind of trap young people, frankly, in my opinion, at the end of the day, it is just about going and being with God. I think along with that, I can quote a lot of parts of the Bible, but I'm just horrible with references. Where it says, "Do not let anyone look down on you because you are young, but instead set an example in thought, word, and deed." I think young people still, in many ways, can get looked down on in their church, right? In terms of, well, you just think you know everything. Oh, you're a high schooler, you're a college kid, you've only had a job for X amount of time. It hasn't sunk in yet what my stage of life is. Um, don't let that uh, perspective, I would say, take away from the authentic experience you are having faith-wise and the authentic ideas and new ways of creating you're trying to bring.
One of my pet peeves from my entire young adult life serving in some way, shape, or form in youth ministry, one of my pet peeves is when people say, but youth and young adults are the future of the church. And it drives me bonkers because they're not the future of the church. They are the church now. Like, they have gifts and opinions and questions and spiritual and emotional needs now. We cannot just look at them and say, okay, but you're here. And as long as you are here, then I know the church will be fine in 6 years because you're here now. And that's what I care about, is that you will keep this church that I know and love going. And that eclipses the current gifts of those populations now.
100%. And in an odd way, it also strips the dignity of older members too, in terms of, one of my greatest faith mentors and friends growing up. And I think that makes a big difference at church, right? And I know it's hard not having people your own age there, but there's also a lot of cool older people who really want to connect with you in meaningful ways. And my friend Maryland was in her 90s, but she was always asking me, what are young people thinking about this? And she was coming at it from a different angle. She's thinking, I'm not going to be here in 5 years, right? But what is the thing? But in her own little way, she was still the church then, right? She wasn't past her prime as being part of the church. And that's a really good point, Pastor Becca. How are we not just doing that with talking with young adults about it? We see it most clearly there, but it's actually affecting the complete other end of, life story.
Yeah, it's almost like it's casting like our own individual hopes and dreams on someone else and having that be the basis for our relationship rather than curiosity so that we get to know who they are. And that's what the church is, or that's what the church should be. Who are you and what is your story?
Yes, what is God doing in your life? And just let it roll from there.
Exactly. Exactly.
I just wanted to add in one more thing, Pastor Rebecca, and that's as you're thinking about why are there no young people, young adults in my 20s at my church, finding those other ministries to plug into can make such a huge difference. When I'm home with my parents at the congregation I grew up in, a place I love, sometimes there's a couple people my age, right? And it's nice to see them. But being at church also makes me think of the friends I have all over the country because of Rainbow Trail who are my age. And it makes me think of my really good friends from Abide and the people I still keep in contact with from youth gatherings and now a whole different population set across the world. And they're with me in spirit in a very weird way on Sunday mornings. They're kind of just, flowing through my thoughts. And so as you think about where are the young people on a Sunday morning at my church, think also of the other places where you might meet them and begin defining that as church too, because it's just as valid as an expression as any kind of building.
I agree. Thank you, Ethan, for joining us today and for sharing some of the different ways that God has been present with you throughout your entire life. Well, Ethan, thank you for joining us today and sharing some of the ways that God has been present with you all throughout your life. I am going to point out that one of the things that you are also involved in is you serve as the young adult member or young adult representative on the Southern Ohio Synod Council, which is an amazing way to see a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that the church does. So, friends, if you are curious or you have critique of my call to serve as the mission developer, it is partially Ethan's fault because he serves on our Synod Council. Ethan, if folks wanted to get connected to you on social media, what are the best places to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to reach out. Let me know any kind of comments you have, or if you'd want to talk more about different ministries of the ELCA and how you can be a part of them. It's Ethan Roberts on Facebook. I'm pretty regular messenger checker. And it's eroberts3299 everywhere else. So feel free to drop a message and we can just talk about faith stuff for sure.
Awesome. And friends who may not have caught that, I will make sure to link to Ethan's social media accounts on the transcript for the episode so you can find them very easily there. I invite you to take a few deep breaths in to help center yourself for prayer. A prayer for when I feel alone at church. God who speaks in the quiet stillness of our hearts. Sometimes when I'm at church, I feel alone. And I wonder if you're even there. Sometimes when I'm not at church, I feel like I'm with you because I know you are there. Open our hearts and minds to noticing your presence wherever our days take us. Equip us with curiosity and openness to newness as we explore what living a shared life together, following in the footsteps of Jesus means. And whatever it means, we know that it is also church, even when it is outside of the church building. Amen. Thank you for joining us for our weekly Moment to Us. We are looking forward to growing with each of you and are so grateful you are a part of the Momentous community. In our next podcast, the burning question we're going to be addressing is, can Christians be involved in politics? So join us as we have a conversation with Deacon Nick Bates about the difference between partisan activities and political activities, and how Christians can and are called to engage in these activities. We do want to say thank you to our mission partners, the Southern Ohio Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Their financial contributions and their prayers are instrumental in ensuring the Momentous community continues to grow. This week, I also want to thank Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Upper Arlington for inviting me to join them this weekend to share about Momentous with their adult Sunday school class and to preach and to assist in leading worship with them this Sunday morning. Now, if you have been listening from the very beginning of our podcast, you may recognize this congregation as the first congregation who joined in supporting Momentous as a grant partner congregation. So I am so excited to be able to visit with them and share stories of how God has been at work through this ministry. Worship is at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they gather in person, and they also will be live streaming it on their YouTube channel. And I've included a link to their YouTube channel in the transcript for today's episode on our website. I also want to remind you all about our next gatherings because we have 2 opportunities to connect during the month of November. On Sunday, November 5th, 2023, which is 2 weeks from when this podcast episode drops, on that Sunday, we are going to meet at 10 a.m. for Brood Theology at Java Central, which is in Uptown Westerville. There won't be any kind of set agenda for the day, but we'll gather to talk about whatever is weighing on us that particular day. Generally talking about something related to the Bible and religion and faith and current events and how all of those things are intertwined together. Now, for this gathering, you do not have to show up with any sense that you hold the answer to any of the questions you are bringing with you, because we're going to be working toward our answers together by sharing our expertise and our faith and our life experiences, knowing that God is present through all of those things. We'll plan to meet for about an hour and a half, maybe up to 2 hours, kind of depending on what everyone's schedules are and how the conversation is flowing. And if you can't join us right at 10 o'clock, then you're welcome to join us whenever you can get there. The second gathering we have in November is for Bedtime BS, or also known as Bedtime Bible Study. And for that, we'll gather on Sunday, November 19th, 2023, from 7 to 8 p.m. For this gathering, we are going to meet on Zoom so that those who have littles at home that can't be left alone after they've gone to bed can join us. Now, for this particular Bible study, we are going to be looking at and reviewing how ELCA Lutherans read and understand the Bible. And we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking as a group to figure out how often we would like to meet together, which will then help us figure out what portion of the Bible we'll jump into for the next gathering. So remember, this gathering is going to meet for about an hour before we all head to whatever else our Sunday evening needs from us to settle and prepare for Monday morning. Now, if you are thinking about attending, or if you're definitely planning to attend, we are asking for you to RSVP so that we know like how many tables to pull together at Java Central, and to give the staff a heads up on how big our group will be. And we also need you to RSVP for Bedtime BS so you can receive the Zoom link via email ahead of our meeting time. There is a link to the RSVP in the transcript for this episode on our website, and we're also going to be sharing it multiple times on our social media pages so you can find it there. And it's also on the events page of our website as well. Now, anyone is able to attend either of these gatherings, no matter how often you have attended a Christian church or how long it has been since you last attended. You do not need to have the basics of the Christian faith down, because we're gathering to learn and to grow together. So for right now, these gatherings are primarily for adults, but if you have a middle schooler or a high schooler who really likes engaging in these kinds of conversations, they're welcome to join you. They will be included in conversations, and we'll make sure to talk about them in ways that are easy for them to grasp and are developmentally appropriate, so they are part of the conversation too. We will be branching out to offer opportunities for younger kids to gather at some point in the future. And we cannot wait to see you at one or both of these events in November. If you would like to support the ministry of Momentous, you can do so by attending our in-person events and inviting someone to join you. You can also continue to engage with us on our social media pages. If you aren't able to give financially, you can visit our website and find out more information about how to donate electronically and how to support by mailing checks to our Synod's P.O. Box. Each one-time or recurring gift combines together to ensure that Momentous continues to grow. Until our next podcast, remember to breathe deeply, and that God is present with you every single moment.